Hello everybody, WhatCulture Gaming's Adam Cleary here. That's a nice treat for you, isn't it? And I have been, as I suspect many of you have been, sat in pretty much the same seat for a number of months now, playing many video games. And the other day, I got to thinking, that it's been about 6 months almost since the Final Fantasy VII Remake came out, and that was just an extraordinarily good video game, wasn't it? They absolutely nailed that. And I don't mean to sound surprised by that, it's just that, well, I was, to tell you the truth. When they first announced a million years ago they were going to be doing the remake, I was like, okay, alright guys, do what you gotta do, but just don't change anything. Don't change the characters, don't change the story, don't change the narrative, don't change the plot twist, don't change the setup of it, don't change the battle system, don't change the music, don't change anything about that game, because it's about as close to a perfect piece of video game art as I have ever seen. And then of course we jumped forward into the year 2020 and look at that! They changed everything. So it should have been a disaster then, really, because it's not like Final Fantasy as a franchise was even in a particularly good place going into this game. It's really struggled for relevancy and critical acclaim, the kind of stuff we saw in 7, 8, 9, and to a lesser extent 10. It's not really been in the best of nick as a franchise, and yet here they had this game that they should never have been remaking in the first place, and they were remaking it exactly how people didn't want them to remake it. And yet they changed so much about that game that they've changed everything about the franchise as a whole, forever now. Now, I'm genuinely serious about all of this, and I will now, through the medium of both YouTube and my sofa, explain, because my name is Adam Cleary, and this is how the Final Fantasy VII Remake changed the franchise forever. Right, I just want to start with how the game actually plays, because if you are a video game franchise and you are not a Dragon Quest or Pokemon, then the transition from turn-based action to just live, fighty, punchy, kicky has not been a particularly smooth one to come about, because that's just how people like to play games now, and only a scant few have resisted the change. I mean, it's fair enough, most big successful franchises take their origins all the way back to a time when consoles just couldn't handle like the modern way of battling. You had to have things turn-based because you had to input your commands and it would queue it up and it would animate as much as it could animate in a given time. You couldn't have everything going off at once because, well, little puffs of smoke would come out of your SNES or come out of your Mega Drive. But now that the technology has improved, everybody wants to be as in the moment, as exciting, as kapow, bang, splat, blah, 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 as they possibly can. It's a word. And the thing people forget, and by people forget, I mean most of our audience is probably too young to appreciate, oh my god, I'm so old, is that when Final Fantasy VII first came out, it did actually take the standard battle system we'd seen in so many RPGs and make it feel real and exciting, because time bars, they filled up and it gave a sense of urgency where there previously hadn't been one. It felt like being at the very forefront of video game combat development, but now it's kinda dated. Very dated, in fact. And I will level with you entirely here. When I first heard that they were basing it loosely on the Final Fantasy 15 game, I was like, oh god, oh no, please, I put in one button and then 500 things. No, that's not enough, that's bad. But the system, which is a balance of the very old classic style and the modern style, is so perfect and so well done. It is the magic formula that so many other games, not even just Final Fantasy games, have been striving for years and years and years. They kind of have to not ever change that. I think that's about as perfect as you're going to get for this, and every Final Fantasy game going forward should feel like you're playing Final Fantasy VII, which I know they won't want to do because Final Fantasy games always try and have a slight different feel on previous battle systems, but you ain't going to improve that one, so don't. More than the combat though, right, is the characters, because you played any kind of RPG before, you know that it's going to live or die by the strength of its characters. Like, they're asking you to put in a 40, 50, 60, sometimes 100-hour commitment to these constructs, these fictional beings, so if they're not good, neither is the game. And you know exactly what I'm talking about here. You have played some games in the past, which are, and Ben Roy, you're listening, I need you to cue up the censoring noise because I'm going to swear now. You've played some games that are garbage piles, and yet if the characters are good and interesting and fun and believable and investable, You don't really mind how it plays because you want to follow that story. Which is why when I was told they were going to restrict the Final Fantasy VII Remake to just Midgar, I was like, oh, this is going to play terribly, because the way the characters develop in that game is across a much longer time frame. You want me to sit here and put in 30 or 40 hours to, like, just generic JRPG stereotypes? Like, think about Cloud up until he has that first freak out at the Temple of Ancients. The guy is just constantly moody and very two-dimensional, and I will fight all these baddies and use my materia, but also no, I have angst. But you know what they did in the Final Fantasy VII Remake, which they did not do in any previous Final Fantasy games? They made all those side quests, all those fetch quests, all that busy work, they gave it all like a flavour of narrative. Every single thing about it expresses a part of Cloud's personality, far more than you probably realise when you're playing it. Don't get me wrong, watching his Buster Sword wave about for hours and hours on end as you run from point A to point B, and then, oh god, gotta go see the Chocobo at point C, and oh, this kid needs me to find a dog at point D, and he's gonna blow my own brains out at point E. While that does get very repetitive, the actual bits of story that it gives you for doing it are kind of worth it. And it's the time in that he spends with Aerith, with Barret, with Tifa, and the rest of Avalanche, who are themselves so more fleshed out in this game, that it just softens him as a character. It kind of shows you the person he's going to become in the rest of the game. And the Final Fantasy games tend not to do that. They don't like to put a lot of narrative or stuff in their busy work. They just want you to go do the busy work to stretch the game out. And that will change the franchise going forward, because think about every single small level and area in the remake. Like, it all feels alive. It's all got characters who you need to properly interact with rather than just get a direction off. So that'll have to be the new norm going forward, surely. And speaking of locations really quickly, I just want to take a moment to talk to you about Midgar. Like, arguably in the top 3 most recognisable gaming locations ever created, after of course Hyrule and Habbo Hotel. Like, the place was, it felt massive on PS1, but it was unexplorable other than the little places you wanted to go to, whereas in this, it feels alive. And the thing is, it feels so alive. It almost feels like you can go and explore any single part of it, that the game benefits a lot as a result of that. Like, the differences between the haves and the have-nots in this city are worthy of discussion away from the plot, almost on themselves. And I think that might inspire future Final Fantasy games to not worry so much about a giant world that you need to traverse across your mission, but to create a world, even if it's in a small geographic location, that you can explore in more detail. Like, I would rather play a game in a city the size of Midgar, where I got to see it all, than to play a game on a giant made-up world where I'm only going to see what feels like a tiny fraction of it. Just on the subject of Midgar, it kind of got me thinking about something that should be a lot more prevalent, a lot more present, a lot more just common in Final Fantasy games, but didn't really seem to be until I played the remake, and that is, like, diversity. Like, take Final Fantasy 15, for example, right? There is genuinely a great game underneath it all somewhere, but if you go to Galden Key or you go to Adlysia or anywhere like that, yes, these are visually stunning locations that are presented as very different for the purposes of the plot, but realistically, there's not really that much different to them. Everybody there looks the same and sounds the same and just is the same. But in Midgar, that's just not true at all. Like, the differences between the haves and the have-nots, yes, they are there and worthy of social commentary, but also just the differences in the backgrounds and the stories and the behaviour, and just every single character that is in that city feels like they've got their own story to tell. They feel like very different people with very different lives and just very different everythings. I actually, tell you the truth, always thought it was a failing of the original game that they made such a big song and dance about Barret saying these people have nowhere else to go. Their home is their home, no matter how bad it is, but yet didn't really weave that in to the story at all. But yet in Final Fantasy VII, when you eavesdrop on all these characters and you hear everything they're going through and what they're trying to do and just everything, all the detail put into these characters, you get it. You see their struggle. You see why they are here in spite of how just awful it is. And you know what that helped with? All the goddamn side quests, because there was a genuine sense of, do you know what? Cloud and Barret and Tifa, they have a skill set that these people do not need and yet desperately, desperately rely upon. Like, if we do not help these people, if I do not go find that child's dog or go and collect that debt, who will? And then, obviously, it goes without saying, slight spoiler here, when the plate does drop, Jesus, did you feel that in a way you never felt it in the original? And I genuinely hope that will change the franchise going forward, because they've just created a stunning world that you can invest in from a playing perspective. I really cared about Midgar and the people in it in a way I haven't cared about the people inhabiting any location in a Final Fantasy game for decades, absolutely decades. They have got a really good formula here, and it's worthy of them continuing. And I'll tell you what, Final Fantasy VII will really change going forward, right? It proves that in spite of all the misfires, in spite of all the detractors, in spite of all of that, the Final Fantasy franchise still has it. And I know people will be dismissive of that and be like, well, it was a remake. Does it really prove that? Of course, it was going to be a success. But think about it. They didn't listen to people like me who said, don't change anything, whatever you do. They changed everything. It's virtually a new game for all intents and purposes, and yet it was a commercial and critical triumph. Like, yes, they took the original story and the original characters and the original narrative, and they stubbornly held on to the things that made it a great game 20 odd years ago, but they also added as much as they could to it. They weren't afraid to change parts of the story. They weren't afraid to reimagine some of the characters. They completely reframed where it was set. They came up with a battle system which combined stuff from decades ago with stuff from 5 minutes in the future. Like, they were not afraid to make changes to this. They were not afraid to do new things with this. And if we are talking about them doing new things in the future, it proves that, well, they could be great. The bottom line is, right, that if you change the names, you change the faces, you change the look, you change certain elements of this, so it wasn't Final Fantasy VII, it was Final Fantasy 16, and they were in the city of Gidmar, and it was Stroud Kryfe and his merry men going after Refisoth, it would still be a brilliant f***ing game. The thing is, I was excited to play and indeed paid money for the Final Fantasy VII Remake because it was a remake of Final Fantasy VII. But I loved the Final Fantasy VII Remake because it was just the best Final Fantasy game I have played in so long. And if they can take the lessons they have learned from making this into the franchise going forward, then sky's the limit, lads. Get the high wind. So that is at least what I think. Anyway, let me know what you do in the comments below. Of course, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. In the meantime, though, thank you so much for watching. This has been an all too rare appearance on WhatCulture Gaming from me. I really can't believe it's genuinely been 6 months since that game came out. 2020 is just a ride, isn't it? Anyway, get me on Twitter at Adam Cleary. Get everybody from WhatCulture Gaming on this address. I couldn't remember precisely how it was spelled out, but in the meantime, thank you so much for watching. I've of course been Adam Cleary. I'm good at my job. Shut up, and I'll see you soon. Goodbye.